What made you, in the first place, paint the industrial scene, apart from any other scene? What took you into it?
Well, I was painting landscapes that nobody wanted and portraits that nobody wanted for a very long time. And going to live in Pendlebury in 1909, it was quite a different landscape than I've been used to. And I was fascinated by it because it was very grim in those days. It's all altered now. And I didn't like it at first. I disliked it, got used to it, and then got fascinated by it. And then I began to say, has anybody ever put this on the painted this seriously? Not just one or two, but seriously. I couldn't have made inquiry, I couldn't find anybody had. So I said, well, I'll try and put this on the map if I'm capable of it, and I'll drop out then.
In this episode of the Lives of the Artist podcast, I'm going to explore the artist L.S Lowry's life. One of the most important British painters in the history of art that is famous for depicting working class scenes and industrial scenes of northern England, particularly around the Manchester area. Now, it's been 50 years since L.S Lowry died, and he is one of the most important artists that Britain has ever produced. Not only for seeing the side of British culture that no one else had ever stopped to paint, to observe, to put onto canvas, but also because he just lived this very brave life in a part of England that wasn't typically an area of England that produced great artists. You know, he was really unique in that, and also unique in his life, that it took such determination to create these works of art, which I'll go into, and how he created these works of art and the vision that he had. And I really think that his life is worth celebrating and worth exploring. So let's delve into the life of L.S Lowry.
Painted because I thought it was a very wonderful subject matter. In a sense, you'd paint a still life or anything else. And at first they were laughed at by people, and the little figures were called black beetles and all the rest of it. But I wanted to do them, and I did them, and then I stopped doing them. The strange thing about it is that when the cotton trade disappeared, my interest disappeared. And I hadn't been aware of that at all when I was doing them. Couldn't do a mill scene now. Wouldn't want to. It's an episode that's gone out of life, hasn't it, really?
So Lawrence Stephen Lowry was born on the 1st of November in 1887 at number 8 Barrett Street in Stretford, which was then in Lancashire, in the north of England. Apparently it was a difficult birth for his mother, Elizabeth, and she had hoped for a girl and was very uncomfortable even looking at him as a baby boy. She later said that she envied her sister Mary, who had 3 splendid daughters instead of her clumsy boy. When he was a child, he had this great desire to be a painter from an early age, and looking back, he said he had no idea whether he'd succeed or not. Now, his parents weren't particularly interested in art, and in fact they thought he was a little odd being so interested in it, although his mother did play piano. She was musical, but she never actually taught her son Lawrence to play the piano. So he had this complex relationship with his parents. His mother had a reputation for being quite demanding and neurotic and quite critical of her shy son. And his father, Robert Lowry, was a very quiet and distant man, quite reserved. But despite this tension, Lawrence remained fiercely devoted to their memory for the rest of his life, even after they died, which we'll go into later. He had their portraits hung, pride of place, in his living room, right up until his death. He also filled it with their old furniture, keeping hold of his parents' furniture is a real interesting insight into how he thought, later on in life. He was very rich and successful from selling his paintings, but, he had the money to buy new furniture, any furniture he wanted. But what he valued most was, his parents' old furniture, and maybe even the love of his two parents that arguably, they couldn't provide him with. And that's what he really ultimately wanted and what he needed. He needed his parents' love, and he was always searching for that. Now, even though he became famous for painting working class scenes, his own upbringing was actually relatively middle class. And for much of his young life, the family lived in Victoria Park, which was quite a wealthy, leafy suburb of South Manchester. His father had a white-collar job working for Jacob Earnshaw and Son, property company, an estate agency, and the family had a maid, and Lowry was educated at a private school. He wasn't the most academic student, but he loved drawing at school. So when he was 17, he enrolled in evening classes at Manchester School of Art. Now, although he practiced for years painting and drawing in these early years of his Manchester School of Art days, he really did struggle to find a distinctive style of his own. And his early work is kind of unremarkable in a way. It's almost as though he's trying to understand how old masters painted landscapes and still lives, but he couldn't quite resonate with it. But then something remarkable did happen in the year 1909. The family went to live in Pendlebury, which in those days was completely industrial. And he said that he had never seen anything like it. He had never seen an industrial world like that at all. He thought it was awful initially. And Pendlebury was only a few miles from Victoria Park, but it couldn't have been any more different. It was a very working class area of Manchester. It was dominated by cotton mills, which was the trade that had turned Manchester into a large and wealthy industrial city in the 1800s. It was famous for its cotton mills and its cotton production. And Lowry had been sheltered from the dirty reality of manufacturing, and now he was surrounded by pollution, by noise, by poverty. And the Lowry family made the move to this part of town because they were in financial difficulties. They had overstretched themselves trying to live this middle-class existence in Victoria Park. Lowry's mother had felt they had gone down in the world, and it was a bit of a shock to the system for her and also for her son. Lowry said that for a long time he just couldn't get used to his new surroundings. But then after a while, he did become used to it, and he also just became absolutely fascinated with this new world that he found himself in. And he realized that he wanted to capture these scenes in paintings. He also realized that it probably had never been captured before by any other artist. And this was, a new visual language. He captured something in his paintings that was quintessentially Northern English at an extraordinary moment in British history. He painted the people and the places that other people ignored. And he loved the energy and the spirit of the people of Manchester and the people who worked in these factories. A world that has disappeared now, Britain now literally has no industry left. It was the backbone of what built the British economy, the Industrial Revolution, the factories of Britain that were just this workhorse that pumped out things. And his paintings are these great social documents of this vanished, Northern English world. He said that it was just pure chance and providence that he started painting these paintings, it was a revelation that really he never moved away from. His paintings are full of the passion and the movement of this northern Manchester world, and he brings out the beauty of the industrial architecture as well of that time in British history. And he was able to show working class culture and hardship as it actually was. He doesn't depict these working class communities in a miserable way, though. He understands that people worked hard, but he also knew that they like to have a laugh. They like to go to the football. They like to get drunk. They like to go to the fun fair. They like to go to the seaside. He never actually shows people working. Going to work, yes. Famously, hundreds of people in his, industrial scenes walking to and from the factories, walking to the pubs after work. Yes, he paints that, but never actually anyone working. But he was a very complex and secretive man. And he had this entire other life. He had a day job as a rent collector. He worked for the same property company for 42 years, from 1910 until 1952. The reason he didn't want anyone to know that he was a rent collector is because he didn't want anyone to know that he only painted in his spare time and that he was actually an amateur. He really wanted to be taken seriously. It's a hard secret to keep. And when he's pressed on the subject, it becomes quite tricky for him to answer. His friends said that they didn't have the slightest clue that he was a rent collector or even that he had a job at all. Some of his friends only found out about this aspect of his life actually after he died. He was actually asked in an interview if later on in his life, if he had ever had a job, and he answered, "I've had a lot of jobs. Let's leave it at that." So clearly it was, a part of his life that he found very hard to reconcile and explain. But to be a rent collector in those sorts of communities in Northern England, he would have been very unpopular because people are struggling and they're trying to make ends meet in very difficult economic times. And he's knocking at the door, looking to get them to cough up money. No working class person had a job as a rent collector. So he's not seen as one of them, I don't think. He's also, seen a little bit as the establishment. So he's kind of an outsider in both respects. But in a way, this gives him the opportunity to walk around and observe life from this different outsider kind of perspective. And he walked around the streets collecting rent, but he would do little sketches on the back of envelopes, on the back of notebooks that he would take with him. And then he would take these sketches home and paint in the evenings or on the weekends, working these little sketches up into these bigger paintings that he produced, hundreds of. And this becomes a lifelong habit. And if you actually, look at photographs at the time and compare them to Lowry's paintings, you see that there is a huge difference, really. He's not a documentary realist artist. His work seems to be naive almost, although it's anything but naive. But there is something about the simplicity, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that we can understand and we can feel and we can relate to it. And he is transforming what he sees into his truth. The exuberance that he sees, the energy that he sees, the vibrancy that he sees, the irrepressibility of the Manchester spirit and the Manchester people. And his Manchester paintings really define almost what it is to be from Manchester. It's grandeur, it's grime, and how they sit together. It's a special place. It really is a special place with very special people. And he sees this and he paints it. And that's what all great artists do. They see something that no one else can quite see, and they capture it with their own visual language. He said once that he didn't like the south of England and that it was harmless, with no guts, and it was a horrible place that was dead of life. Now, let me explain something to people that are not from England to give some more context to this comment. Now, the north-south divide in England is not simply geography. In the 18th and the 19th centuries, the north became, like I said before, the workhorse of the Industrial Revolution that started in Britain, and cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, Newcastle upon Tyne roared with mills and factories and foundries and shipyards, and they produced cotton and steel and coal and engineering, and it flowed out to build not just Britain but the modern world, the British Empire. And the north was a place of production, of physical labour, of collective struggle to produce this stuff. And its identity was, tough and resilient. Meanwhile, the south, especially London and the university cities like Oxford and Cambridge, evolved as centres of administration, of finance, education, political power, really. And the south governed, calculated, interpreted, while the north built and produced. Now, from this grew this kind of mutual mythology, really, that the north was backwards, was poorer, was less refined, and its accents were kind of caricatured. It felt that its culture was misunderstood or dismissed by the south. And in response, the north cultivated its own kind of inverted snobbery, this fierce pride in authenticity and in plain speaking. To be northern was to be tougher, more direct, less pretentious, shaped by harder conditions and less illusion that the southerners had. And the south, in this view, became synonymous with kind of softness, privilege, and detachment from the reality of, hard working class people. And this divide is no longer purely industrial today. There are wealthy northern areas and struggling southern areas of Britain. But culturally, this mythology remains very potent and still today. But Lowry celebrates the North not just subjectively in what he paints, but also in how he paints it and with what emotion he gives it. I think that why he's so celebrated in the North is because he captures something of its spirit. Particularly if you are from a poor area, let's say of Manchester, there's a sort of pride that someone from that type of background could make it and be creative and be an artist in the world. But because he portrayed working class lives and working class communities, people assumed that his artworks are a kind of political statement and that he was left wing or socialist or something. But he said that his paintings were simply just put onto canvas, what he saw, and that there was no propaganda in them at all and no political significance to any of them. He said that the working class that he painted were quite happy and accepted their lot in life, and he didn't really like politics at all. He considered himself a complete political outsider. He sold his first painting in 1921 and he got the sum of £5 for it. Now, he was 35 years old and he'd been painting for a long time at that point. He said that the family, or his family, got the shock of their lives and they didn't think it was possible that he would ever sell anything. His friends used to laugh at him for painting and even told him to give it up. So it took an incredible amount of determination to carry on at points in his life. Try and paint for years and years and no one wants your artwork. It's a very, very, very difficult thing to carry on when that's the case. When, there has to be this inner compulsion within you to carry on. It's easy to keep pumping out work if it's selling it to the highest bidder, but would you really keep doing something if no one paid you to do it? And you're not getting anywhere in the world because you're doing it? Would you really carry on? Ask yourself that. Would you really carry on doing it? You might do, but it's a very difficult thing to do. And to keep doing it, that's all I'm trying to say. It's just an incredible thing. And he said that for 30 years he painted things that no one wanted. And he was asked later on in life whether he knew his paintings were good. And that's why he carried on. Now, you'd expect him to answer, yes, I always knew, and I always had this singular vision. But in fact, he answers, no, I just couldn't help myself from doing it. He had this inner compulsion. This is an amazing insight into how he thought, into how his brain worked, into his emotional landscape. Being comfortable with failure is often easier than being comfortable with success. And his parents didn't really like his paintings during these years either. It must have been very, very tough for him. They were sympathetic to him. They were supportive to him. But they just had no interest in what he was doing and no real interest in his art. And they didn't really pay attention to it. His mother would actually turn his paintings to the wall when visitors came over to the house. So there are these two sides to Lowry. The side that wears his suit and tie and goes to work every day. And then there's this side that, that's the side that his mother likes. His mother likes to see this son of hers that's going to the office every day. But then, at night, he comes home and he goes into his studio and he is an artist and he's painting. And, he always lived with his parents all his life up until their death. So, from the time he was born until they died, he took care of him. So there must have been this closeness to his parents, of course, but it seems like it was a complex relationship. He said that he was a home bird and he never even thought about getting married once in his life, and that he'd never been in love. He said that he once was interested in a girl, but she died in an epidemic. So Lowry would often drop hints about women in his life, and the prime example of this is Anne, which is a series of portraits of a woman he called Anne, and they are varying versions of this sitter. He would describe her as a girl that he knew when he was young, or a friend of his mother's sometimes, or sometimes she was an artist, sometimes someone that he knew that worked with the poor. But despite extensive research by so many people, art historians and Lowry experts, she still remains an absolute mystery. No one seems to know who this imagined figure was in his life, and biographers can't find any sexual relationships with anyone, male or female, at all, ever in his life. And that's not to say that it didn't happen, but there is just no evidence of it anywhere. What is this? Is it arrested development, or was it just that he really just was asexual? He just wasn't interested, or was he, devoted to his art? It's difficult to know. We can only ask these questions. We have no, real answers, but we just don't know. But some people like being on their own, and he did convey, this sort of intimacy through the instrument that was his art. At night he would finish his work and he would go into the studio and he would spend long sessions painting. I think he realizes at some point in his life that he doesn't belong to the art world, and that he doesn't really belong to society that he lives in as well. In fact, he doesn't really belong anywhere, but maybe that outsider spirit is actually what makes his art unique. The observer of life, rather than belonging to life in any particular way. He's really the outsider observing life. Now, in 1932 onwards, when he was 45 years old, he went through a very difficult period. His father died in 1932. And when his father died, the family discovered that he was heavily in debt. And this revelation really brought home how loose the middle class respectability his mother had yearned for really was. And his mother then became bedridden for the rest of her life. And he looks after her. He works during the day, and then he comes home, makes her dinner, reads to her in bed, and then in the evening he goes and he paints in his studio until the small hours. And during that period, he is under immense psychological pressure. And we can see that reflected in his paintings. There's one portrait, and it's almost a self-portrait, but it becomes an image of the state of his mind. It's a man very wary, a man under deep, deep stress, giving the viewer a very disconcerting gaze back. And he has bloodshot, glaring eyes, and they're looking back at the viewer. And I can just imagine him late at night, looking at himself in the bathroom mirror after a long painting session, and just seeing this horrific view of himself, looking straight back, and just trying to capture that image, that horrific image of himself. And he just must have been going through so much during this time. And then in October of 1941, his mother dies, just under 10 years after his father dies. His mother dies, and he had never actually been apart from her his whole life. They'd been together his whole life, and he could barely eat or sleep. He was even unable to pick up a paintbrush for months after her death. And the first painting that he made after she died, months later, was a painting called The Bedroom in Pendlebury. And it was about a year that he painted this after her death. And it's of his mother's room, and he captures it, but his mother's not there. His mother, who spent the last years of her life basically living in the bed, is gone. And so it's a picture of an empty bed and a picture of absence, really. He said that he felt like he was going crazy during this period, and it was the lowest period of his life. To add to this, the Second World War was raging around him. It's 1941, and the Blitz is happening. Both Manchester and Salford were targets for the Blitz. And Lowry he found a job during the Blitz as a fire watcher. So what that meant was he spent long, cold nights looking out for fires that were started by bombs that were dropped. And he'd have to try and stop them from spreading and put the fires out. So he'd spend, nights standing on Manchester rooftops while bombs fell all around him, which was an incredibly dangerous job. And he said that he wasn't worried about living or dying during these days at all, probably because, the amount of stress he was going through and the depression that he was in from his mother's death. So this was a very difficult time for him during the war. But he also brought himself to paint a series of works that showed the aftermath of the Blitz. And it showed large parts of Manchester that he was so fond of that were just reduced to rubble. And it was never going to come back, and he knew that. These buildings were reduced to rubble and they were gone forever. And after this huge national trauma, the Second World War, where everyone has banded together, and there's this real sense of British spirit in the world that, people are starting to really look at what actually made Britain great. And there was this sense in the world that the war had been won by Britain, that stood up to the bad guys, and they'd just, they'd won this very just fight, this just war. And who were these British people? What made them tick? And after the war, people wanted to see what the heritage of British people was, and the working class people of Manchester that Lowry captured suddenly really mattered. And after the war, Britain got its first Labour government, and there was this huge drive to improve the conditions of the working class in Britain. and to recognize these teeming millions that are usually overlooked. But the knock-on effect is that Lowry suddenly gets this audience, this new audience that are interested, and they start to take notice of his work. And in 1952, he's actually by then in his mid-60s, but he finally retires from his job and he stops being a rent collector, and the demand for his work is skyrocketing with both public and private collectors, and he's starting to make serious money from selling his paintings. And he starts to get a profile in the press, and the interviews begin, and he says that he felt that it had taken a long time to be recognised. And by the time it all happened, he wasn't actually that interested. In a sense, it had all happened too late. And he was past being interested by that point. And that actually there was no one to really share it with. His parents were dead. And so he didn't really care at all when it all went well for himself finally. So, that's another quite deep insight into how his brain worked at the time. Anyway, he finally achieved the status that he'd always dreamed of, and he'd always dreamed about this, selling his painting, being a real serious artist, taken seriously. But it didn't come with the reward that he actually wanted. And I think that he thought, well, if I become an extraordinary artist on some level, I can be loved by my parents. But when that didn't happen, I think it just burst a bubble in his mind, and he realized it was all kind of a scam, and he will never really get the approval that he so long dreamed of. And he said that life was really this tragic comedy. He did say that in an interview, that he thought that life was a tragic comedy. Anyway, in the 1960s, there is this huge appetite for his industrial scenes that he became so well known for. And of course, he keeps painting them, but it's at this point that the world that he depicts just starts to disappear. At the start of the 20th century, when Lowry begins painting these pictures, there are over 2,000 cotton mills in Manchester alone. Now, by the 1960s, there are around 100 mills left. So you can see how the landscape completely changed. He recorded the world really at the end of the Industrial Revolution, and then it just disappears off the face of the earth. Lowry said that the world that he recorded vanished, and it never really came back. Now, that's not what he set out to do, but that's just what happened. That's just the way life went. Not only did the mills disappear, but so did the terraced houses that feature in so many of his paintings too. There was a nationwide program after the war to demolish houses that were deemed to be overcrowded or unsanitary and not fit for modern living. In Manchester and Salford, over a third of the old housing stock was demolished, and it was a process known as slum clearance. And the houses that Lowry walked around collecting rent from, and the streets that he painted, and the neighbourhoods that he knew like the back of his hand, he knew these neighbourhoods so well, they were just obliterated. The people who lived there were shipped out to new massive council estates built on the outskirts of Manchester, and Lowry felt alienated from all of it. He felt that the true community life of Manchester had gone. He changed his interest in, these street scenes to painting homeless people during this period, or as he called them, down and outs. And he was fascinated in how these people got into these positions in life. And he said that they were wonderful people. And really, it was very, very tragic that they all ended up like this. I think he had this real empathy for these people who had fallen on hard times, because I think he genuinely does think that he was lucky not to have found himself in their position. It's interesting. Later in life, he still believes that the bubble could still be burst and he could always end up like them. He could lose everything. There's this sense of insecurity that's still there for him. He sees homeless people as this great subject that he, really focuses on for the years after he stops finishing these, stops painting these factory scenes of the Manchester working class, and he focuses on these homeless people. I think he sees himself as an outsider, and I think he also sees these people as outsiders, these homeless people as outsiders, and he really identifies with them. I think he likes to observe things that most people don't like to observe, really. Like in his paintings, The Cripples, which is possibly a painting that people might just walk past in embarrassment in a gallery, as we don't use that term anymore about disabled people, but that's the name of the painting. And at that time, people like this would have been hidden in institutions. But Lowry paints a whole landscape of people of all shapes and sizes, and some of them look directly at the viewer, challenging their gaze. They're on crutches, they're on sticks, they're on tractors with no legs. He said that he didn't do it justice, actually, and that he didn't really bring the reality of these people's lives to the canvas properly, and that actually he made it prettier than it really was. Now we move to the last period of his life, and in this last decade of his life, he focused almost on seascapes only. So, this was what became his favorite subject in his late paintings. This artist who everyone loved for painting scenes of people was now making paintings with no one in them at all. They are bleak, they are empty, but they're representing his mind at the time and his state of, being. In his last years, he said that he became sick of painting, and ultimately he gave painting up in his final years, and he said he just got too old to even paint. But he lived until he was old, and he lived up until he was 88, but he just seemed to retreat completely from society in his last years, and he just saw society changing all around him too fast, and he hated it. And he said that everyone that he associated with when he was young was gone, and that when he was young he couldn't imagine that there'd ever be any changes at all. But the older that he got, he seemed to think that everything was changing. So he basically just became a recluse and gave up painting. When he was a younger artist, he was able to respond to the world around him with compassion and generosity. Although he was really a complete outsider, it was actually, in the end, his great strength. He was a great observer of humanity and understood that humanity's strengths and weaknesses and how they lived their lives, whether happily or not, was actually the most important thing to depict. Lowry holds the record for rejecting British honours 5 times, including a knighthood in 1968 that was offered to him by the Queen. This is incredible. This is, firstly, it's a record. No one's ever rejected that many. But secondly, that just shows what kind of man he was.
I've seen a lot of things happen here, and I don't like change. I don't like my old friends going, old people of my own age. But it's progress got to be. We can't all stay forever. We were bonny looking lot if we did, wouldn't we? Yeah.
Although he said in a late interview that art was the most important thing in his life, he also said that life itself wasn't that important at all. Lowry died of pneumonia at the Woods Hospital in Glossop in Derbyshire on the 23rd of February 1976 at the age of 88. He was buried in the Southern Cemetery in Manchester next to his parents.